Unaware his wife controlled the $50 trust about to save his failing company, he divorced her in public to marry his mistress, but he had no idea he was humiliating the one woman who held his entire future in her hands. He thought the packed luxury venue was the perfect stage for his new beginning, but it became the place where his empire started to collapse. His mistress smiled beside him in a designer gown, but she did not know the money, status, and power she wanted were all tied to the wife she helped betray. His mother clapped proudly from the front row, but she never realized the quiet woman they had mocked was the true owner of the venue, the trust, and the final signature that could save them. For years, his wife had stayed silent while he dismissed her, underestimated her, and treated her like a burden, but silence was never weakness. She knew every secret behind his failing company, every hidden debt, every desperate investor meeting, and every lie his mistress believed. He thought divorce would free him, but it exposed him. He thought public shame would destroy her, but it awakened a power he never expected. When she finally stood up, the room went silent. One calm decision changed everything. The billion-dollar rescue vanished. The venue contract turned against him. The mistress lost every luxury she had stolen her way into. His mother, who once celebrated the betrayal, was left with nothing but regret. This shocking billionaire revenge story reveals what happens when a betrayed wife is pushed too far, but instead of begging, she takes back her name, her fortune, and her power. He wanted a public divorce, but what he got was a public downfall no one would ever forget. And the first person to understand that the air in the room had changed was not Julian Voss. It was his attorney. Graham Ellison had spent 27 years cleaning up the disasters of wealthy men who mistook arrogance for strategy. He had watched CEOs lie on television, heirs gamble away family fortunes, and founders destroy billion-dollar mergers with a single careless sentence. He had seen pride walk into courtrooms wearing custom suits and leave with nothing but a signed settlement. But he had never seen anything as reckless as Julian Voss standing on a gold-lit stage in front of 200 guests, announcing that his wife was finally releasing him from a loveless marriage, while his mistress held his hand like she had already won. Graham's smile froze before the applause began. From the front row, Margaret Voss clapped with sharp, bright satisfaction. Her diamonds flashed beneath the chandelier lights, but her eyes were colder than the stones around her throat. She had spent years whispering into Julian's ear that Amelia Hart was ordinary, that Amelia had trapped him, that Amelia should be grateful to have been chosen by a Voss. Now Margaret's lips curved as though she were watching a coronation. Beside Julian, Celeste Vale lowered her lashes and pretended to be modest, but her smile betrayed her. She had practiced this expression for weeks in the mirror of a penthouse Julian could not afford. Sweet, triumphant, wounded by scandal, but brave enough to love. She squeezed Julian's hand as cameras lifted around the room. Amelia stood alone beside the center aisle. She wore no jewels except her wedding ring. For a moment, everyone looked at the ring. It was simple, almost too simple for the wife of a man whose company had once been valued in the billions. Julian had chosen it 9 years earlier, when he was still ambitious instead of entitled, when he had promised her that one day he would buy her something worthy of her. Amelia had smiled then and told him worth did not always shine. He had laughed at her for that later. Now he glanced at the ring with irritation, as if the sight of it offended the new life he had staged for himself. Amelia, Julian said, his voice smooth through the microphone, I know this is painful, but dignity matters. We can do this gracefully. A few people murmured approval. They had not heard the insult inside the sentence. Amelia had, Graham had, even the servers standing along the wall had. Dignity matters. Julian was divorcing his wife at a charity gala hosted in her family's private venue, beside a woman who had spent 6 months calling Amelia the background noise, in messages she thought no one would ever read, but he wanted dignity. Amelia lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in memory. 9 years earlier, Julian had waited outside a small library in the rain, holding 2 paper coffees and a folder full of impossible projections. His company then was nothing more than a rented office, a collapsing prototype, and a name no investor trusted. He had been drenched, nervous, and brilliant. Amelia had been 24, still using her mother's last name publicly, still hiding the Hartwell inheritance behind a life designed to look modest. "I don't need your money," Julian had told her that first year, long before he knew what money she truly had. "I just need someone who believes I'm not crazy." She had believed him. That was the tragedy. She had believed him before the world did. A waiter near the stage shifted his tray. A glass trembled softly against another. The tiny sound carried farther than it should have, and Amelia remembered another glass, another tremble, another warning she had ignored. It had been at their engagement dinner. Margaret had lifted a champagne flute and smiled at Amelia in front of the family. "To my son," Margaret had said, "who was always destined for a woman of value." The table had gone quiet, but Julian had laughed too loudly and kissed his mother's cheek. Amelia had pretended not to understand. Later, he told her Margaret was traditional, not cruel. He said she would warm up eventually. But cruelty, Amelia learned, did not need warmth to grow. It only needed permission. Julian adjusted his cufflinks now. They were platinum, engraved with his initials, a gift from Amelia after Voss Meridian closed its first international deal. He had worn them tonight like proof of his greatness, but he had forgotten who had paid the jeweler when his accounts were frozen. "Say something," he said softly, no longer into the microphone. The guests leaned forward. Amelia looked at him then, fully. Julian had expected tears. He had counted on them. He knew Amelia's quietness, but he had mistaken it for fragility. In his mind, she would break under public humiliation, sign whatever documents Graham prepared, and disappear into some gracious private sadness while he and Celeste became the glittering future of Voss Meridian. But Amelia did not cry. She removed her wedding ring. The movement was so small that the cameras almost missed it, but the sound of the ring touching the rim of a water glass seemed to pass through the room like a struck bell. Julian's expression tightened. Celeste's smile flickered. Margaret stopped clapping. Amelia turned, not to Julian, but to the elderly man seated near the side entrance. He wore a dark suit, a silver tie, and an expression of such patient certainty that Graham Ellison felt a chill move beneath his collar. "Mr. Alden," Amelia said. The old man rose. Several guests recognized him at once. Theodore Alden did not attend social events unless the event itself had financial consequences. He was the trustee no one could reach, the lawyer no one could pressure, the man behind companies that existed on paper but owned half the city's most valuable land. Julian stared at him, confused. What is he doing here? Theodore looked at Amelia, not Julian. "As requested, Mrs. Voss." Amelia gave a faint smile. "Heart." Julian blinked. Theodore corrected himself without hesitation. "As requested, Ms. Hart." The room heard it. So did Julian. Graham Ellison slowly closed the folder in his lap. That was when the first piece of foreshadowing returned to Julian, sharp and useless. 3 days earlier, in his office, the emergency financing team had told him the Hartwell Trust was prepared to save Voss Meridian from collapse. The trust's identity had been concealed behind layers of private equity and legacy holdings, but the offer was real. $2 billion in immediate liquidity, $8 billion in structured debt relief, enough to keep the banks quiet, the board loyal, and the press distracted. There was only one missing item: a final signature. Julian had slammed his hand on the conference table. Then get it. His CFO, Daniel Reeve, had hesitated. "We don't know who the controlling signatory is." "Find out." "We tried." "Try harder." Daniel had looked exhausted. "Julian, whoever controls it has blocked all direct contact. Alden and Rowe will only say the trust is reviewing your conduct." "My conduct," Julian had laughed. "This is business." Daniel had not laughed with him. At the time, Julian thought the delay was an old money power game. He thought some board trust heir wanted better terms. He had not imagined the controlling signatory lived in his own house, slept in a room he had stopped entering, and still knew how he took his coffee. Now Theodore Alden stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Theodore said, his voice calm but carrying. "This event was booked under the Voss Meridian Charitable Futures Foundation. As of this evening, the venue's ownership has exercised its contractual right to terminate all affiliated hospitality extensions, branding privileges, media exclusivities, and private accommodations connected to the Voss party." A ripple moved through the crowd. Julian stepped forward. "You can't do that." Theodore did not look at him. "It has already been done." Celeste leaned toward Julian. "What does that mean?" Julian ignored her, but his mouth had gone dry. Amelia finally faced the guests. Her voice was not loud, but no one missed a word. "It means the gala is over." At first, no one moved. Wealthy rooms did not know how to respond to calm women who ended things without asking permission. Then staff members began appearing at the doors. Not security in dramatic black suits, but venue managers with tablets, polished smiles, and the kind of professional firmness that could remove a billionaire more efficiently than shouting ever could. The orchestra stopped playing. The giant screen behind Julian, which had displayed the Voss Meridian logo, went dark. Then it lit again with a different emblem. Hartwell House. The name drew a collective inhale from the older guests. Hartwell House was not merely a venue, it was a legend disguised as architecture. 4 generations of wealth had passed through its marble halls. Presidents had dined there. Royal families had stayed there. Deals that reshaped industries had been whispered beneath its painted ceilings. Julian had once joked that Amelia could never understand places like this. But she had learned to walk in Hartwell House before she learned to read. Margaret rose from the front row, gripping her clutch. "Julian." For the first time that night, her voice sounded old. Amelia looked at her mother-in-law. "Mrs. Voss, your temporary residence in the East Guest Wing was connected to your son's foundation reservation. Since that reservation has been terminated, the staff will help you collect your personal belongings." Margaret's face drained. The East Guest Wing had been her home for almost a year. She had told everyone she was between estates because she was renovating her villa, but Amelia knew the truth. Margaret had mortgaged the villa twice, borrowed against jewelry she claimed was heirloom, and used Julian's company accounts as if they were private allowances. When the creditors began circling, Amelia had quietly allowed her to stay at Hartwell House, not because Margaret deserved it, but because Julian had begged. "She's still my mother," he had said then, standing in Amelia's study after midnight. "Please, Amelia, I know she's difficult, but she has nowhere else." Difficult. That was the word men used when they wanted women to forgive cruelty without naming it. Amelia had said yes. Margaret had repaid her by planning this public humiliation. Now Margaret shook her head. "You can't throw me out." "I'm not throwing you anywhere," Amelia said. "I'm ending a benefit you never respected." Julian stepped between them. "Enough, Amelia, you're embarrassed, I understand, but don't make this ugly." She almost smiled. He still believed he could define the scene. "You made it public," she said. "I'm only making it accurate." Cameras shifted toward Julian. The same media team he had hired to capture his rebirth now captured his confusion. His jaw hardened as he realized the optics were slipping beyond his control. Celeste's fingers dug into his sleeve. Theodore opened a leather folio. "Additionally," he said, "the Hartwell Legacy Trust has completed its conduct review of Voss Meridian Holdings." Daniel Reeve, standing near the bar with a glass of untouched water, closed his eyes. He knew. He had suspected for weeks, but suspicion was not proof. The delayed financing, Amelia's sudden questions about offshore subsidiaries, her quiet request for the latest shareholder reports, the way she had asked Daniel gently whether the bridge loan depended on integrity clauses. He had told her yes. He had not known he was speaking to the woman who could enforce them. Theodore continued. Due to material misrepresentation, undisclosed personal expenditures, reputational risk, and breach of preliminary disclosure terms, the trust withdraws all pending rescue consideration, effective immediately. The words landed like falling stone. Julian stared at Amelia. What did you do? The question should have sounded powerful, but it sounded afraid. Amelia remembered the first time he had asked her that. 7 years into the marriage, he had come home furious because a deal he thought impossible had suddenly closed. He had found her in the kitchen making tea and demanded, "What did you do?" as though kindness from the universe could only be theft. She had introduced him to a retired shipping executive. That was all. She had mentioned his name at lunch, vouched for Julian's intelligence, and opened a door. Julian had walked through it, and later told people he had kicked it down himself. Now she answered with the truth. "I protected what belongs to me." Celeste laughed once, sharp and nervous. "This is ridiculous. Julian, tell them she doesn't own anything, she's just..." She stopped because Amelia turned to her. Celeste had built her entire confidence on one belief: Amelia was beneath her, too plain, too quiet, too domestic, too willing to stand in the background while Julian shone. Celeste had imagined the wife as a locked door, not realizing she was the foundation beneath the house. "Just what?" Amelia asked. Celeste swallowed. "Nothing." But the word had already condemned her. A memory passed through Amelia's mind, unwanted but clear. 6 months earlier, she had walked into Julian's private office to leave an envelope from the auditors. Celeste had been there, perched on the desk, laughing at something on Julian's phone. Amelia had paused outside the half-open door. "She dresses like she's apologizing for existing," Celeste had said. Julian had replied, "Amelia doesn't care about appearances." "That's convenient," Celeste said. "You need a wife who looks like a wife, not a ghost haunting your hallway." Julian had chuckled. Not loudly, not cruelly enough for anyone else to remember. But Amelia remembered. That night she had stood in front of her closet and touched the blue silk dress her mother once loved. She had not worn it because she realized she no longer dressed for rooms that refused to see her. Tonight she wore black. Not mourning. Precision. The venue manager approached Julian. "Mr. Voss, we'll need your party to vacate the stage." Julian rounded on him. "Do you know who I am?" The manager's expression did not change. "Yes, sir." That made it worse. Because there had been a time when the question opened doors. There had been a time when saying Voss made bankers stand straighter, journalists soften their headlines, and politicians return calls within minutes. But that time had been purchased with borrowed money, hidden losses, and Amelia's introductions. Without the trust, without the venue, without the illusion, Julian was just a man shouting into a microphone that had already been turned off. Margaret hurried toward Amelia. Her heels clicked against the stage steps. "Amelia, sweetheart, let's not be emotional." Sweetheart. In 9 years, Margaret had never called her that unless she wanted something. Amelia looked at the older woman's shaking hands. For a second, pity threatened to rise, not forgiveness. Pity. Margaret Voss had built her life around status so completely that without it she seemed hollow, like a porcelain vase cracked from the inside. But then Amelia remembered the front row applause. She remembered Margaret leaning toward a guest as Julian announced the divorce and whispering, "Finally." Amelia's voice remained gentle. "Your driver has been notified." "My driver," Margaret repeated. "His employment was paid through the foundation." Margaret's eyes widened. "He has also been released." "You vindictive little..." "Careful," Theodore said softly. The word carried the force of a locked gate. Margaret stopped. Julian finally seemed to realize the danger was not emotional. It was legal, financial, structural. The stage beneath him was collapsing, but not in a way cameras could sensationalize. It was worse. It was paperwork, contracts, clauses, signatures, the invisible machinery of power turning against him with the quiet inevitability of sunrise. He lowered his voice. "Amelia, we should speak privately." The room waited. For years, private conversations had been Julian's weapon. In public, he smiled. In private, he corrected her posture, her tone, her friendships, her usefulness. In public, Margaret praised family. In private, she reminded Amelia she had not produced an heir. In public, Celeste acted wounded by love. In private, she sent photos from hotel balconies Julian claimed were business trips. Private was where they expected women to bleed quietly. Amelia shook her head. No. The single word did more than any speech. Julian's face tightened. No. No, she repeated. You wanted witnesses. The cameras loved that. Amelia heard the faint clicks, saw the phones rising higher. She did not perform for them, but she understood their hunger. People wanted a spectacle. Julian had offered them a betrayed wife. Amelia gave them a reckoning. Graham Ellison stood abruptly. My client will refrain from further public comment. Julian turned on him. Sit down. Graham did not sit. Julian, I strongly advise. I said sit down. Graham looked at Amelia, then at Theodore, then back at Julian. In that glance, an experienced man did a calculation faster than fear. He represented Julian Voss, but he understood the source of survival had moved. I'll be outside, Graham said. And he walked away. That was the second collapse. Attorneys did not abandon winning men in public. Celeste watched him leave, and a shadow of understanding crossed her face. She had not loved Julian, not in the way novels meant it. She loved a rival. She loved being chosen above another woman. She loved the feeling of walking into rooms where people envied her. Julian had been the vehicle, but a vehicle with no fuel was only a liability. She leaned close to him. Fix this. Julian whispered back, I am fixing it. But he was not. Amelia stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted. No one touched her, no one stopped her. People who had ignored her for years suddenly studied her as if her silence might have contained instructions they had missed. Some looked embarrassed, some fascinated. A few looked afraid, which saddened her more than it pleased her. Power had always made people more respectful than kindness did. At the bottom of the steps, Daniel Reeve waited. Ms. Hart, he said quietly. Daniel. I tried to warn him. I know. Daniel's eyes were tired. The banks will call by morning. They already called. He exhaled. Of course they did. For years, Daniel had been one of the few executives who never treated Amelia like furniture. He had noticed when Julian began using company funds for personal extravagance. He had questioned invoices from Celeste's brand consultancy, a company with no employees, no deliverables, and a payment structure that looked suspiciously like lifestyle support. He had warned Julian that liquidity was not loyalty. Julian had called him anxious. Amelia had called him privately 2 weeks later. Would Voss Meridian survive a full audit? She had asked. Daniel had been silent for a long time. Then he said, not under Julian. That answer had broken something in her, but it had also set her free. Now Daniel looked toward the stage, where Julian argued with the venue manager, and Celeste pretended not to panic. What happens next? He asked. Amelia slipped her ring into her clutch. Consequences. Outside, rain had begun to fall over the courtyard. It glazed the stone paths and blurred the city lights beyond the iron gates. Amelia paused beneath the covered entrance and breathed in the damp air. She loved rain. Her father had loved it too. Julian used to hate that about her. Rain ruins everything, he would say. No, her father once told her when she was 10, standing with her in the gardens of Hartwell House during a storm. Rain reveals what was built well. That sentence had lived inside her for years. It returned now with a force that almost made her cry. Her father, Elias Hart, had not been an easy man, but he had been a precise one. He taught Amelia that wealth was not money, but responsibility under pressure. He taught her to read balance sheets the way other children read fairy tales. He taught her to ask who benefited, who paid, and who disappeared from the story. When he died, the world assumed his fortune passed into distant management because Amelia was too young, too private, too uninterested in power. That was what the world had been allowed to assume. In truth, Elias had left her the Hartwell Legacy Trust with one instruction written in his own hand. Never rescue a man from the consequences he refuses to understand. Amelia had thought that sounded harsh when she was 21. At 33, standing outside the gala where her husband had tried to erase her, she finally understood it was mercy, not for the man, for everyone else. A black town car pulled up. Theodore joined her beneath the awning. "You handled that with restraint," he said. "Did I?" "Yes." "I wanted to scream." "I know." She looked at him. Theodore had been her father's closest advisor, and after Elias died, the nearest thing Amelia had to a guardian. He had watched her marry Julian with concern he never voiced too strongly. He respected choice, even when he feared the cost. "You warned me," she said. "I suggested caution. You said ambition without gratitude becomes appetite." Theodore's mouth twitched. "That sounds like me. I thought love would make him better." "No," Theodore said gently. "Love reveals what people do with what they are given." Behind them, guests began leaving in clusters, murmuring beneath umbrellas. The gala had become a story before the night ended. Amelia could already imagine the headlines. Billionaire CEO humiliated. Mystery wife revealed as trust heiress. Rescue deal withdrawn after public divorce stunt. She hated the noise that was coming. But she did not regret the truth. Inside, Julian finally pushed past security and stormed into the entrance hall. Celeste followed, lifting her dress to keep it from brushing the wet marble. Margaret came behind them, pale with fury, trailed by a staff member carrying 2 garment bags and a suitcase embossed with her initials. "Amelia," Julian shouted. Theodore stepped forward, but Amelia lifted a hand. Julian stopped a few feet away from her. Rain misted around him. His hair, usually perfect, had fallen across his forehead. For one disorienting second, he looked like the man outside the library 9 years ago. Then he spoke, and the illusion died. "How much do you want?" Amelia almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so exactly him. "You think this is about money? It's always about money with people like you. People like you." The phrase told her he still did not understand. He had slept beside her for nearly a decade and still imagined her as an outsider to her own life. He had accepted her emotional labor, her contacts, her patience, her quiet loans, her forgiveness, and her family's invisible infrastructure, but he still saw her as an obstacle. "No," she said, "with people like you, it is always about ownership." His eyes sharpened. "You're my wife. Not after tonight. You think a performance changes that? You made the performance, I accepted the ending." Celeste stepped forward. "Julian, don't waste your breath. She's trying to punish us because you chose happiness." Amelia turned to her. "Happiness doesn't need invoices." Celeste went still. Julian's head snapped toward Celeste. "What is she talking about?" Celeste's lips parted, but no sound came. Amelia did not need to explain, not yet. She had already sent documentation to the board, the auditors, and the trust's legal committee. Celeste Vale Consulting had received 7 payments from Voss Meridian in 9 months. The descriptions were vague: brand strategy, executive image alignment, international positioning, but bank records told a clearer story. Couture, travel, a penthouse deposit, jewelry, a private account in her sister's name. Celeste had thought being a mistress was expensive for Julian. She had not understood it could become evidence. Theodore opened the car door. "Amelia." Julian stepped closer. "Don't get in that car." There it was again, the command disguised as desperation. For years, Amelia had obeyed smaller versions of it. Don't call him out. Don't embarrass my mother. Don't question the payments. Don't come to the office unexpectedly. Don't make Celeste uncomfortable at investor dinners. Don't wear that dress. It sends the wrong message. Don't speak to Daniel without me. Don't turn this into something it is. But it had always been something. She looked at him through the rain. Goodbye, Julian. Then she got into the car. As it pulled away, Amelia did not look back, but the glass reflected enough. Julian stood under the lights, with Celeste beside him and Margaret behind him, all three surrounded by luggage, cameras, and rain. For the first time in years, Amelia slept through the night. Julian did not. By 6 the next morning, the first headline appeared. By 7, 3 banks had requested emergency calls. By 8, Voss Meridian's stock began sliding. By 9, the board's independent directors demanded a special meeting. By 10, Graham Ellison resigned as Julian's personal counsel, citing conflicts related to newly disclosed financial realities. Julian sat in his office, watching everything unravel on 6 screens. He had built that office to feel like command: floor-to-ceiling glass, black walnut desk, abstract art chosen by a consultant, a model of Voss Meridian's first successful engine prototype displayed under museum lighting. The room had once made investors feel they were stepping into the future. Now it felt like a beautiful box filling with water. Daniel entered without knocking. Julian looked up. Tell me it's contained. Daniel placed a folder on the desk. It's not. What are we looking at? Immediate liquidity crisis, accelerated debt triggers, potential fraud inquiries depending on how the board interprets the Celeste Vale payments. Hartwell withdrawal means we miss payroll in 12 days unless we sell assets fast. Julian's face hardened. Don't use her name like she matters. Daniel stared at him. Hartwell. Amelia. Daniel's expression shifted. He had been loyal to the company, not blind to the man. She matters more than anyone in this building right now. Julian stood. You work for me. I work for Voss Meridian. I am Voss Meridian. Daniel's voice stayed flat. That belief is one of our problems. For a moment, Julian looked as though he might throw the folder. Then his phone rang. The screen showed his mother's name. He rejected it. It rang again. He rejected it again. Daniel watched in silence. Margaret had called Julian 17 times since dawn. The staff had escorted her from Hartwell House to a hotel, but by morning her card had been declined. The hotel manager, polite but firm, informed her that the reservation had not been guaranteed. Her driver no longer answered. Her assistant resigned by text after months of unpaid salary. The storage company holding her villa furniture demanded immediate payment. Margaret Voss, who had once instructed Amelia on the responsibilities of marrying upward, sat in a hotel lobby beside monogrammed luggage and discovered the world could become very practical when one had no valid card. But Julian could not help her. That was the part Margaret had never imagined. She had raised her son to believe women were extensions of male ambition. A wife should support, a mother should advise, a mistress should admire. Money should move toward the Voss name because the Voss name deserved movement. But she had failed to teach him how to build anything that could stand without someone quietly holding it up. At noon, Julian called Amelia. She did not answer. At 12:05, he called again. At 12:10, Theodore Alden sent a message. All future communication should proceed through counsel. Julian threw the phone against the wall. The screen cracked, but the message remained readable. That evening, Amelia returned to Hartwell House alone. The venue had already been restored, the stage removed, the flowers donated, the floors polished until no trace of Julian's performance remained. That was the strange mercy of old houses. They had seen too much to be impressed by scandal. Amelia walked through the ballroom slowly. In daylight, the room looked softer, Without cameras and applause, it returned to itself, carved columns, pale walls, tall mirrors reflecting emptiness. She stopped near the spot where Julian had stood. There was no mark there, no stain, no proof that a marriage had ended beneath the chandeliers. But Amelia felt it. She saw flashes of the night before. Celeste's smile, Margaret's applause, Julian's command, the ring against the glass. Then another memory rose, older and quieter. Her wedding reception had been in this same ballroom. Julian had stood beneath the same lights, nervous and radiant, whispering into her ear that he felt like an imposter among all that history. "You belong here," Amelia had told him. He had looked at her then with such gratitude that she believed it would last. But gratitude, like love, required tending. A soft footstep sounded behind her. Nora, the house manager, approached with a silver tray. On it sat a single envelope. "This arrived by courier," Nora said. Amelia recognized Julian's handwriting immediately. For a moment, she considered refusing it, then she opened it. "Amelia, last night went too far. I know you're angry, but we both made mistakes. I'm willing to meet and discuss a reasonable path forward. The company employs thousands of people. Don't punish them because of our personal issues. Call me." Julian. No apology. No confession. Only repositioning. Amelia read it twice, not because it hurt, but because it clarified. Nora waited. "Should I prepare a reply?" she asked. Amelia folded the letter. No. But that night, she wrote one anyway. Not to Julian. To the employees of Voss Meridian. The next morning, every worker received a statement from Hartwell Legacy Trust. It was careful, legal, and compassionate. The trust would not rescue Julian Voss or his executive leadership, but it would establish an employee protection fund if the board agreed to remove compromised management, preserve wages during restructuring, and cooperate with a forensic audit. Daniel called her within minutes. "You're offering a bridge around him," he said. "I'm offering one around the collapse. The board will take it." "Will they remove him?" Daniel was quiet. "After yesterday, yes." The board meeting lasted 4 hours. Julian entered convinced he could dominate the room. He wore a navy suit, a white shirt, and the same platinum cufflinks Amelia had given him. He expected fear. He expected loyalty. He expected the directors to remember the years when his vision made them rich. But fear had shifted direction. The chairwoman, Evelyn Cho, sat at the head of the table with a printed copy of Hartwell's offer. She was 70, razor-minded, and allergic to theatrics. Julian had underestimated her too because she rarely raised her voice. "Julian," Evelyn said, "the board has lost confidence." He laughed. "Confidence? This company exists because of me. It may cease to exist because of you. That trust is manipulating you. That trust is the only reason we are not filing emergency insolvency motions before Friday." Julian looked around the table. No one defended him, not the directors he had golfed with, not the investors he had entertained, not the executives whose bonuses he had inflated. Even those who disliked Amelia understood arithmetic. "You can't remove me," he said. Evelyn slid a document across the table. "We already have." The silence afterward was total. Julian did not read the document. He stared at it as if words could become loyal if ignored. "Effective immediately," Evelyn said. "You are suspended pending investigation. My shares are pledged as collateral against personal guarantees, several of which are now under review. My office will be secured by legal. My company, not anymore." Something in Julian's face changed then, not humility, not remorse, but recognition that the world had not merely embarrassed him, it had moved on without asking. He stood too quickly, knocking his chair backward. "You'll regret this." Evelyn looked tired. I already regret waiting this long." Security escorted him from the building he had once entered to applause. The employees watched from behind glass walls and half-open doors. Some looked shocked, some relieved. A few looked sad, because Julian had not always been the man he became. There had been a time when he knew the names of engineers' children, when he slept beside prototypes, when he talked about changing an industry instead of conquering it. But success had not made him cruel. It had revealed where cruelty could afford to live. As Julian stepped into the parking garage, his phone buzzed with another crisis. "Celeste." He almost ignored it, but then he remembered Amelia's remark about invoices. He answered, "What?" "They froze my accounts," Celeste said. Julian stopped walking. "Who did?" "I don't know. My bank said compliance review. My landlord called. There are reporters outside the building." Julian closed his eyes. "Did you move money from the consulting account?" "Silence." "Celeste." "I did what you told me to do. I told you to keep receipts. You told me not to worry. That is not the same thing." Her voice sharpened. "Don't you dare blame me. You said she was nobody. You said the trust was separate. You said by the time anyone looked at the invoices, we'd be married and protected." Julian looked around the garage. A security guard pretended not to listen. "I said a lot of things," he muttered. Celeste laughed bitterly. "Yes, you did." By the end of the week, Celeste Vale Consulting became the easiest part of the scandal for journalists to understand. The public did not always grasp debt structures, holding companies, or trust governance, but they understood a mistress billing a failing company for image alignment, while employees feared layoffs. Her followers turned first, then her sponsors, then her creditors. Celeste had built an online persona around luxury, elegance, and women who choose themselves. But luxury rented with questionable money had no foundation. The penthouse was leased. The couture was financed. The jewelry was borrowed against expected marriage. The car was in Julian's company's name. Even the engagement ring, flashed proudly in private stories she had planned to release after the gala, had been purchased through a corporate concierge account. When the auditors arrived, glamour became inventory. 2 weeks after the gala, Celeste sat in a conference room across from 3 attorneys and learned the language of bankruptcy. Her mascara was perfect, but her hands shook beneath the table. "I didn't know," she said. One attorney glanced at the documents. "You signed the consulting agreements." Julian said, "Everyone did it that way." Everyone does not invoice $800,000 for strategic visibility without deliverables. Celeste looked toward her own lawyer, who had warned her not to speak emotionally, but emotion was all she had left. "I loved him." The attorney across from her did not react. "Love is not a defense to wire transfers." That sentence, later, haunted her more than the headlines. Meanwhile, Margaret moved from hotel lobby to friend's guest room, then from the guest room to a short-term rental she could not afford after the first week. Each move was smaller than the last. Her social circle responded with the refined cruelty of people terrified by misfortune. Invitations vanished. Calls went unanswered. Women who once admired her seating charts now claimed they were traveling when she asked for help. Margaret blamed Amelia, of course. Blame was easier than memory. But memory came anyway. It came in the shape of Amelia standing in a hospital hallway 3 years earlier, holding Margaret's coat after Margaret fainted during a charity luncheon. Amelia had cancelled meetings, spoken gently with doctors, and stayed until Julian arrived. Margaret had woken, seen Amelia, and said, "Where is my son?" Amelia had answered, "On his way." Margaret had turned her face to the wall. Memory came again in the image of Amelia quietly paying the tax penalty on Margaret's villa through a family office account, then never mentioning it. Margaret had called it temporary liquidity mismanagement. Amelia had called Theodore and authorized payment because Julian sounded ashamed. Memory came in a dozen kindnesses Margaret had treated as weakness. Now, in a borrowed apartment with peeling paint near a train station, Margaret stared at a stack of final notices and realized kindness had been the only wall between her and the weather. She called Julian again. This time he answered. "I need money," she said. "So do I. Don't be vulgar." He laughed once. "Vulgar, mother, I was removed from my own company." "Then get it back." "How?" "Go to Amelia, apologize." The word tasted bitter, even through the phone. Julian sat in a serviced apartment paid through a credit line that would not last the month. His watch was gone. His car had been repossessed pending ownership review. His name, once an asset, had become a warning. "You told me to leave her," he said. "I told you to be strategic." "You clapped." Margaret went silent. Julian leaned back against the wall. For the first time, he allowed himself to say what had been building since the gala. "You hated her because she didn't need us." Margaret's breath caught. "That is not true." "It is. I protected you." "No, you worshipped the version of me that made you feel powerful." He expected her to deny it, but she did not. Instead, her voice cracked. "I'm your mother." "I know." That was the tragedy. He loved her, he resented her, he needed her to be guilty so he did not have to be, but guilt was not a limited resource. There was enough for both of them. After the call, Julian sat in the dim apartment and remembered Amelia on the first morning of their marriage. She had made pancakes badly, burning the edges and laughing at herself. He had teased her, kissed flour from her wrist, and told her they would never become like the cold couples they saw at galas. "When I get unbearable," he had said, "promise you'll tell me." "You'll listen?" she asked. "Always." He had meant it then. But promises made before power were easy. The test came after. He remembered the first time he ignored her warning. Voss Meridian had just secured a major investor. Julian wanted to expand aggressively into 3 markets at once. Amelia reviewed the plan at his request and told him the debt exposure was dangerous. "You sound like Theodore," he snapped. "I sound like someone who read the numbers." He accused her of not believing in him. She backed down. That became the pattern. Whenever she questioned him, he translated caution into betrayal. Whenever she helped him, he renamed it coincidence. Whenever she endured him, he called it loyalty. And whenever she grew quiet, he assumed he had won. Now the quiet was everywhere. At Hartwell House, Amelia did not celebrate. That surprised people who expected revenge to look like champagne and laughter. Instead, she worked. She sat with auditors, attorneys, employee representatives, and interim executives. She approved emergency wage guarantees. She redirected funds toward suppliers who would have been destroyed by Voss Meridian's collapse. She insisted that lower-level employees not be punished for executive misconduct. "Julian will say you did this to ruin him," Theodore said during one late meeting. "He'll be wronged." "But not entirely." Amelia looked up. Theodore's eyes were kind, but not soft. Part of you wanted him to feel it. She did not deny it. "Yes. That does not make the decision unjust." "I know." "Do you?" She set down her pen. Outside the study windows, rain tapped against the glass again. "I wanted him to understand what he took for granted," she said, "but I also know that if he had not staged that gala, I might have kept trying to save him." Theodore nodded slowly. "That is why public cruelty is sometimes a gift," he said. "It ends the private negotiation." Amelia looked toward the portrait of her father above the fireplace. Elia's heart's painted face held the same stern patience he had worn in life. She wondered what he would think of her now, whether he would be proud of the restraint or disappointed by the years she lost before finding it. A week later, she found a letter in her father's old desk. The desk had been locked for years. Nora discovered the key while cataloging items in a storage room, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Amelia almost put it aside, but some instinct made her open the drawer. Inside lay a sealed envelope. For Amelia, when she mistakes endurance for love. Her knees weakened. She sat before opening it. Her father's handwriting filled 2 pages. He had written it during his illness, when Amelia was still engaged to Julian. He did not mention Julian by name. He did not need to. My darling girl, you have always believed that patience can heal what pride damages. Sometimes it can. More often, it teaches pride that damage has no cost. I hope the man you choose understands the difference between being supported and being carried. I hope he sees you, but if he does not, remember this: you are not cruel for closing a door someone keeps using to enter and wound you. Power will frighten you because you have seen what it does to lesser hearts. Use it anyway. Use it cleanly. Use it with witnesses. Use it to protect those who cannot protect themselves, but never use it to keep someone who would only love you powerless. I built the trust so you would never have to beg, not for money, not for respect, not for freedom. Come home to yourself when it is time. Your father. Amelia cried then. Not with the controlled sadness she had permitted herself in marriage, but with the grief of a daughter who finally understood she had been loved with foresight. The letter did not erase the years, but it gathered them into meaning. Her father had not saved her from pain, but he had left her a path out of it. That night she slept in her childhood room. The next morning, she removed Voss from every private document that still carried it. Julian saw the official change 3 days later in a legal notice. Amelia thought. No hyphen, no trace. The sight affected him more than the board removal. He stared at her name until rage became something dangerously close to sorrow. He went to Hartwell House that afternoon. The gates did not open. He pressed the intercom. Tell Amelia I'm here. A guard's voice replied, Ms. Hart is unavailable. She'll see me. She has declined. Julian gripped the steering wheel of the rented sedan. Tell her I'm not leaving. There was a pause. Mr. Voss, remaining outside the gate will not change her answer. It was said politely, but it was still a sentence he had never been taught to survive. He stayed anyway. For 47 minutes, he sat outside the gates where he had once arrived as family. Rain threatened but did not fall. Through the ironwork, he could see the long drive lined with trees, the house distant and golden beyond them. He remembered coming there for the first time, overwhelmed by its scale. Amelia had taken his hand. It's just a house, she said. But it was not just a house. It was history, protection, proof that she belonged to something older than his hunger. He had resented it before he understood it. He had told himself she diminished him by having what he did not, but the truth was worse. She had offered him belonging. He had tried to turn it into ownership. Eventually, Theodore appeared at the gate. Julian stepped out of the car. I want to talk to my wife. Theodore's expression did not change. You don't have one. The words struck with surgical precision. Julian looked away. I made mistakes. Yes. I was under pressure. Yes. I need to explain. No, Theodore said. You need her to absorb the consequences so you can call them resolved. Julian's face flushed. You've always hated me. I distrusted you. Same thing. Not at all. Hate is emotional. Distrust is evidence-based. Julian laughed bitterly. Did you teach her to talk like that? No, her father did. The mention of Elia's heart made Julian stiffen. He had always hated being compared to a dead man he could not outperform. Elia's had built quietly and left permanently. Julian had built loudly and lost control. I loved her, Julian said. Theodore studied him, perhaps, but you loved being forgiven more. For once, Julian had no answer. Theodore softened by a fraction. There is a way forward for you, but it is not through her. Julian looked toward the house. A curtain shifted in an upper window. but he could not tell if anyone stood there. What way? Tell the truth, cooperate with the audit, return what you can, stop confusing humiliation with injustice. Julian shook his head. That will destroy me. No, Theodore said, it may reveal what is left. Inside the house, Amelia had not watched from the window. She had wanted to. Instead, she sat in the library with Daniel Reeve and Evelyn Cho, reviewing restructuring proposals. Voss Meridian would survive, but it would be renamed after its core technology, stripped of Julian's vanity projects, and governed by an independent board. Thousands of employees would keep their jobs. Suppliers would be paid at reduced but fair terms. The company would shrink, but it would live. Are you sure you don't want your name attached? Evelyn asked. Amelia shook her head. No. It would restore confidence. It would create dependency. Daniel looked at her with something like admiration. Most people would want credit. Credit is expensive. Evelyn smiled faintly. That sounds like Elia's. Amelia felt the ache of it, but also the warmth. The restructuring announcement came the following Monday. Markets responded cautiously. Employees responded with relief. Julian responded by going silent. For 3 weeks, no one heard from him publicly. Then the investigation deepened. The auditors found more than Celeste's invoices. They found payments authorized under pressure, loan covenants massaged into compliance, personal expenses routed through executive accounts, and a pattern of concealment that would not be easy to dismiss. Julian had not stolen like a cartoon villain. He had rationalized like a desperate founder. A dinner here, a flight there, an advance against future compensation, a favor to his mother, a consulting payment to Celeste, a temporary shift in reporting. But temporary lies become permanent when success depends on them. Julian's legal team urged cooperation. Margaret urged denial. Celeste, facing bankruptcy and possible civil claims, chose survival. She turned over messages. The most damaging was not financial, it was personal. In one exchange, weeks before the gala, Celeste had asked, "What if Amelia makes a scene?" Julian replied, "She won't. She's too trained to be graceful." Those 7 words spread across the internet by nightfall. Too trained to be graceful. Amelia read them alone in the garden. She did not cry this time. She closed the article, placed the phone beside her, and looked at the roses her mother had planted before she died. They were blooming late that year, pale and stubborn against the heat. The gardeners had warned that pruning them too aggressively might weaken them. But they came back stronger. Foreshadowing did not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it bloomed quietly in a garden after a hard cut. The public turned Amelia into a symbol which made her uncomfortable. Some called her ruthless, others called her queen. Editorials praised her restraint. Videos dissected her dress, her ring, her posture, the exact second Julian realized he had lost. Strangers projected their pain onto her, their fantasies, their anger, their hope. Amelia avoided most of it. But one letter reached her. It came from a junior accountant at Voss Meridian. "Ms. Hart, you don't know me. I worked in internal reporting, and I was one of the people pressured to make numbers look better than they were. I was afraid to speak up. I have a daughter, and I kept thinking about losing my job. When the employee fund was announced, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. Thank you for not letting all of us go down with him." Amelia read the letter 3 times. Then she pinned it inside her father's desk. Not because it praised her, because it reminded her what power was for. Julian's downfall did not happen in one dramatic moment after that. It happened in reductions, the penthouse listed, the club membership suspended, the private jet account terminated, the watches sold, the invitations stopped, friends became advisors, then acquaintances, then unavailable contacts. His name disappeared from conference panels. His portrait came down from the Voss Meridian lobby. The company's new name, Meridian Systems, appeared where his name had been. He watched the unveiling online. Daniel Reeve stood beside Evelyn Cho at the press conference. Amelia was not present, but everyone knew the trust had made the survival possible. Daniel spoke about accountability, innovation, employee protection, and rebuilding trust. He did not mention Julian except once, in a careful sentence about prior leadership failures. Prior. Julian closed the laptop. That word hurt. Not villain, not genius, not founder. Prior. He had become past tense. Celeste's bankruptcy hearing took place a month later. She arrived in a plain suit, no cameras invited, but several waiting anyway. Her lawyer argued that she had been misled by Julian, but documents showed she had understood enough to hide assets when rumors of the audit began. The court ordered liquidation of several luxury items and allowed civil claims to proceed. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked if she had anything to say to Amelia Hart. Celeste paused. For weeks she had rehearsed anger. She had planned to say Amelia ruined her life. She had planned to cry, to blame love, to recast herself as another victim of Julian Voss. But cameras are mirrors when the performance no longer pays. Celeste looked into them and for the first time in months told a small truth. I underestimated her, she said. Then she walked away. Margaret's fall was quieter, but to her more devastating. She moved into a subsidized senior residence after every relative declined to host her. It was clean, safe, and modest, which she experienced as humiliation because no one there cared who she had been. The women in the common room discussed medication schedules, grandchildren, bus routes, and television dramas. When Margaret tried to mention old galas, they nodded politely and returned to practical matters. Practicality became her punishment. One afternoon, a resident named Mrs. Alvarez saw Margaret struggling with a laundry machine and helped her. You turn the dial first, Mrs. Alvarez said. I know that, Margaret snapped. Mrs. Alvarez stepped back. Margaret stared at the machine. She did not know that. She had never needed to know it. After a moment, her shoulders lowered. I'm sorry, she said. Mrs. Alvarez looked surprised, then shrugged. Bad days happen. Margaret almost laughed. Her entire life had become a bad day. That night she sat on her narrow bed and wrote Amelia a letter. She tore up the first version because it blamed Julian. She tore up the second because it blamed Celeste. She tore up the third because it sounded like a request for money. The fourth was short. Amelia, I was cruel to you because I thought kindness made people small. I was wrong. I do not expect forgiveness. I only want you to know that I understand more now than I did when understanding could have mattered. Margaret. She did not send it for 2 days. When she finally did, she expected no reply. She received none. But Amelia kept the letter. Not in her father's desk, not with the accountant's note. She placed it in a separate box labeled Things that arrived too late. Julian's criminal exposure narrowed after months of negotiation. He cooperated partially, then fully when his new attorneys convinced him that Pride had become unaffordable. He admitted to misleading the board about certain liabilities and authorizing improper expenses. Civil penalties consumed most of what he had left. He avoided the worst outcome, but he was barred from executive control in any public company for years. The day he signed the final agreement, he did not feel relief. He felt emptied. Outside the courthouse, rain fell again. He stood beneath a gray sky without an umbrella and remembered Amelia's father's phrase, though he had never heard Elias say it directly. Rain reveals what was built well. Julian looked at the courthouse steps, the cameras, the puddles gathering around his shoes. Nothing in his life had been built well enough. Not because he lacked talent. That was the accusation he wished were true because talent could be mourned. But he had talent, vision, charm, energy. What he lacked was reverence for the hands that steadied him. He had treated support as proof of superiority instead of grace. A black car stopped at the curb. For one wild second, he thought it might be Amelia. It was Daniel. The window lowered. Julian stiffened, Here to enjoy the view. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. No. Then why are you here? I thought someone should tell you the company survived. Julian laughed bitterly. Congratulations. The employees survived, Daniel corrected. That matters. Julian looked away. Daniel continued. Amelia insisted on that. Of course she did. You say that like it's an insult. No, Julian said quietly. I say it like I should have known. Daniel did not answer. After a moment, Julian asked, Does she hate me? Daniel considered lying, but chose not to. I don't think she organizes her life around you anymore. That hurt more than hate. Hate would have kept him central. Indifference made him a lesson. Daniel drove away, leaving Julian in the rain. Months passed. The scandal faded, as all scandals do, replaced by newer disasters, newer betrayals, newer public appetites. But the people who had lived inside it did not fade at the same pace. Amelia rebuilt slowly. She reopened Hartwell House for charitable events, but with stricter governance and no vanity foundations. She established a program for women leaving financially controlling marriages, funding legal aid, emergency housing, and career support. She never used her own story in the promotional materials, but everyone understood the origin. At the first event, Nora found Amelia standing near the ballroom entrance, looking uncertain. Are you all right? Nora asked. Amelia smiled faintly. I keep expecting ghosts. This house has many, Nora said, but most of them have manners. Amelia laughed. It felt unfamiliar, but not impossible. The event was smaller than Julian's gala had been. No media wall, no orchestra trying to impress donors into generosity. Just round tables, warm light, and people who understood money as a bridge rather than a throne. During the reception, a young woman approached Amelia. She wore a simple green dress and held a program with nervous hands. Ms. Hart. Yes. I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to say your fund helped my mother get an attorney. Amelia's throat tightened. I'm glad. She says she forgot what quiet felt like. Amelia nodded, unable to speak for a second. The young woman smiled. Thank you for making a door. After she walked away, Amelia stepped into the hallway and pressed a hand to her heart. A door. Not a weapon, not a spectacle. A door. That was what she had needed once. That was what her father had built for her. That was what she could build for others. Later that night, Theodore found her in the library, barefoot, reading financial reports with a cup of tea going cold beside her. You hosted a successful event, he said. Tradition requires you to sleep afterward. I will. You say that as if it has happened before. She smiled. Theodore. He sat across from her. For a while, neither spoke. Their silence had always been comfortable, but now it carried peace instead of strategy. You know, he said eventually, your father would be proud. Amelia looked down. I hope so. He would also say you should stop reading reports after midnight. That also sounds like him. Theodore reached into his jacket and removed a small velvet box. Amelia stiffened. What is that? Not what you fear. She opened it. Inside was her wedding ring. For a moment, she could not breathe. The staff found it in the water glass after the gala, Theodore said. I kept it until I thought you were ready. Amelia stared at the small circle of metal. It looked harmless now, almost innocent. A symbol only had the power a person continued giving it. What should I do with it? She asked. That is entirely yours to decide. She lifted the ring. It caught the lamplight, but did not shine much. Julian had been embarrassed by its simplicity later. He had offered to replace it with something larger during their 5th year, when investors began praising his taste. Amelia had refused because she still believed in the promise it represented. Now the promise was gone. But the gold remained. The next week, she took it to a jeweler her mother had loved and had it melted into a small pendant shaped like a key. Nora noticed it the first day Amelia wore it. "That's beautiful," she said. Amelia touched the pendant. It used to be something else. Most beautiful things did. The key became her private emblem. No one knew its origin, but people noticed she wore it whenever she signed major trust documents, whenever she opened a new housing project, whenever she walked into rooms where someone expected her to be less than she was. Foreshadowing had become fulfillment. The ring that once marked her as Julian's wife became a key that reminded her she belonged to herself. Julian saw a photo of the pendant online 6 months later. He was living in a modest apartment outside the city, consulting quietly for a manufacturing firm that valued his technical mind but kept him far from financial authority. He had begun therapy because his attorney suggested it might help his public rehabilitation, but he continued because, to his surprise, truth had practical uses. He stared at the photo longer than he should have. Amelia stood at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Hartwell Doorway Initiative. She wore a cream suit, her hair pulled back, the gold key at her throat. She looked different, but not because of clothes or wealth. She looked present. Julian enlarged the image and saw the pendant clearly. Recognition moved through him slowly. He knew that gold. He closed the laptop before he could let memory become fantasy. There were apologies he wanted to make now, but wanting to make them did not mean he deserved an audience. That was one of the harder lessons. Remorse was not a ticket back into someone's life. Sometimes it was only a debt paid privately in changed behavior no one applauded. He wrote Amelia one final letter. Not asking for money. Not asking for a meeting. Not asking for forgiveness. Amelia, I have started and destroyed many versions of this letter because most of them were still trying to make you responsible for my peace. You were my wife, my first believer, and the person I most consistently failed to see. I humiliated you because I believed your grace would protect me from consequence. I called your strength silence because that made it easier to use. I let my mother disrespect you. I let Celeste mock you. I mocked you by omission every time I failed to defend you. I am sorry. You owe me nothing, not a reply, not forgiveness. Not even the comfort of knowing whether this matters. I only wanted to put the truth somewhere outside my own head. Julian. He sent it through counsel. Theodore delivered it without comment. Amelia read it in the garden while the late afternoon light turned the roses gold. For a long time she felt nothing. Then she felt sadness. Then she felt the strange gentleness that comes when pain finally stops asking to be carried. She did not reply. But she did not place the letter in the box labeled Things that arrived too late. She placed it in a new box. Things that no longer hold me. A year after the gala, Hartwell House hosted another event in the same ballroom. This time there was no scandal, no public divorce, no mistress waiting in borrowed diamonds, no mother clapping at another woman's humiliation. The room was filled with scholarship recipients, housing advocates, engineers from Meridian Systems, trustees, artists, teachers, and people whose names would never trend but whose work held communities together. Amelia stood near the entrance as guests arrived. Daniel came with his wife and introduced Amelia to their teenage son who wanted to study sustainable engineering. Evelyn Cho arrived with a cane and a wicked remark about donor speeches. Theodore wore the same silver tie from the night of the gala, but tonight his expression was lighter. At one point, Amelia looked toward the front row. The chairs were empty for a moment before the program began. She remembered Margaret there, clapping. She remembered Julian on the stage. She remembered Celeste smiling. The memory no longer pierced. It passed through like weather moving across distant hills. Then Nora approached. They're ready for you. Amelia touched the gold key at her throat. Do I have to give the speech? Yes. I was afraid you'd say that. Nora smiled. Dignity matters. For half a second, they stared at each other. Then Amelia laughed so hard she had to cover her mouth. When she stepped onto the stage, the room quieted, not with fear, not with hunger for scandal, with respect, the kind she no longer had to earn by shrinking. She looked at the faces before her and thought of every version of herself that had led to this moment. The girl in the rain with her father, the young woman outside the library with Julian, the bride who believed gratitude would last, the wife who confused endurance with love, the woman who stood in a ballroom and removed her ring while the world waited for her to break. All of them were still inside her. But none of them were trapped. I used to think legacy was something we inherited, she began. A name, a house, a trust, a story already written before we were old enough to understand it. But I have learned that legacy is also what we refuse to pass on. Cruelty can end with us. Silence can end with us. The habit of mistaking control for love can end with us. The room was very still. Amelia continued. Some doors are closed because they should never have been opened. Some doors are locked because what waits behind them is not safe. But some doors are simply waiting for someone with a key. Her fingers brushed the pendant. Tonight we build more keys. Applause rose, not sharp like Margaret's had been, but deep and steady. Amelia stood beneath the chandeliers of Hartwell House and felt, for the first time in years, no need to look toward the exits. Outside, rain began again. It tapped softly against the tall windows, silvering the glass, washing the city clean in small patient strokes. Some guests glanced toward it with concern for their clothes and cars, but Amelia smiled. Rain did not ruin everything. Rain revealed what was built well. And this time, when the storm came, Amelia Hart did not lose a thing.